Well, hello, everyone. My name's Katie, and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Library's FrankTALK with Lisa Ireland today. Hi, Lisa. Welcome.
Hi, how are you today, Katie?
Good. I'm well, thank you. Thanks. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Library operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future. I would like to extend that respect to the elders of other communities who may be joining us today. Now, if you have any questions for Lisa, you can pop them in the chat box. So your chat box is where you can type a message in and everybody can view it. So any questions, pop them in that box and we'll be able to ask, I can ask Lisa directly so you can hear the answers. Please make Lisa welcome. And Lisa, please share with us what you'd like to chat about today.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thanks so much for having me today. I kind of feel a bit of an affinity with your side of the bay. I live in Ocean Grove on the Bellarine Peninsula, so way over the other side of the bay to Frankston. But I spend a lot of time in Bayside because I've got two, or actually more than two, quite a few good writing friends over in the Bayside area. So I very occasionally go and write in the libraries over there, sometimes in Brighton with Sally Hepworth. So I feel like it's kind of my second home over that side of the bay. So I thought I would just introduce myself. I can see a few familiar names in the guests that have joined us already, but I know there will be other people here who don't know me. So I thought I would just introduce myself and then talk a little bit about this book, which is my latest book that just came out on the 28th of April, which is called The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. So obviously, I'm Lisa Ireland. I'm an Australian author of contemporary women's fiction, although this latest book is a little bit of a departure for me, and it's got a dual timeline as well as the contemporary timeline. It's got an historical timeline which starts in 1961. So not a deep history, like a near historical timeline starting in the 1960s. Like me, I start in the 1960s too. So as I said, I live on the Bellarine Peninsula. I've been a full-time writer for I think about 7 years, and The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan is my 6th published novel. I had 3 novels published in the genre of rural romance. They were my first 3 published. And then my 4th book, which I'm going to duck and grab here, sorry, just to be out of shot for a second. My 4th book was called The Shape of Us, and that sort of was I diverted then away from rural romance. This is a book about friendship. And then my next book, The Art of Friendship, was another book about friendship. And then in Shirley, well, you'll hear all about that in a minute, but that is a story about love, really. So I guess, as I said, I've been writing for 7 years full time. I moved from Melbourne to the Bellarine Peninsula about 8 years ago, and I had previously been a primary school teacher. And I had on the side, I was working part-time as a primary school teacher, and on the side I had a professional organising business. So, a bit like Marie Kondo, but she wasn't around in those days, so it wasn't so cool back then. But yeah, so I had this professional organising business, but all my clients were actually over at your side of town, over in Bayside. And when we moved down here to Ocean Grove, I decided to close that business up because it was too hard to start again with all the, with trying to generate all new clientele. And it was actually very hard to get a job as a teacher because there are many, many teachers in the Geelong and Bellarine area. So I thought, my husband actually said to me, look, why don't you take some time out for a year or two and see if you can give this writing gig a go? Because I had always wanted to be a writer. When I was young, so I grew up really in the 70s and 80s. When I was young, I wanted to be a writer, but in the way kids want to be a rock star. Like my kids all play guitar and they all want to be rock stars, but they know that really that's not going to happen for them. They're going to grow up and be, I don't know, scientists or something else. They're not probably going to go on tour with Powderfinger like they they know that even though they'd love to do it, it's a fantasy. And that's what writing was for me. I thought I would love to be a writer. I was a voracious reader, and I grew up going to the library. My first memory of a library is actually the mobile library, which I grew up in an outer Melbourne, in the western suburbs, and a new suburb. And we didn't have a library, we just had the mobile van. And so my mum, who was also a voracious reader, would take me to the mobile library when it came every fortnight, and we would, go home with our arms laden with masses of books, and I would get through them well before the truck came around again. And then we were fortunate enough that the library actually opened up in Werribee, closer to sort of our suburb, and I could ride my bike there as I was getting older. But so I grew up as a reader and idolising authors. I always wished that I could write, that I could talk to my favourite authors and ask them questions about the books that they had written. And I thought I would love to write my own book, but it was just a fantasy, like I said. So I kind of parked that idea. I went off to school, did all the things that you do, and ended up as a primary school teacher. But when my third child was a baby and I was on a bit of parental leave from work, I did a course at Holmes Glen TAFE, but it was they had like an offshoot, a program at Yarraville Community Centre, and I went there at night once a week for 4 hours and did the professional writing and editing course, which I loved. And it was actually during a really difficult time in my life. My dad had a terminal illness and my mum had a chronic illness, and I was helping to care for both of them. And I had 3 small children as well. And so it's funny how, like, I look back on that time and I think, how on earth did I have time to do the course, and how on earth did I have time to, because I started my first novel during that time. How did I do that? But I think the writing was cathartic for me. And when I went to the course, no one really knew me. They didn't know about my mum and dad being sick. They didn't know even that I was a mum of young children, or not much about that. And so it was all about the writing. So that 4 hours a week was all about me, which when you're a mum or a carer of any type, that is actually something that you don't get a lot of, do you? You don't really get a chance to just have that time for yourself. So did the course and really got the bug to write. Like, I really wanted to be published. And I remember thinking back then, this is stupid, and anyone who actually writes romance, please forgive me for this comment, because it was the stupidest thing ever. But I thought, I really desperately want to be published, and I think it would be easy to write a romance novel because, they're small, there's usually not a lot of characters, it's probably not that hard. So I set about writing romance novels and sending them off. At this stage in Australia, there were no publishers of romance. There were no Australian publishers that would take a romance from you. So you had to send it off to England, to Mills and Boon, which I did. And to my surprise, I got quite good feedback immediately. So the very first one that I sent, they said, we really like this, but there's a few problems with it. You've got a few too many characters. It's a little bit too Australian. Can you make these changes and maybe we'll publish it? So I was very excited, and I worked on the book for, probably a year. And in the end, it didn't get across the line, because the very thing that readers tell me that they love about my work now, which is a large cast of characters with quite deeply developed characters, were the things that were not really resonating in that particular romance. And I'm ashamed to say that at that point in time, when I was writing those romances, I was not a romance reader. I am now. I now enjoy romance. But at the time, I hadn't really read category romances at all. I dismissed them as rubbish, and which is a mistake, I would say, because there's lots of enjoyment and pleasure to be had in the odd romance, and writing a romance is a skill that I'm not particularly good at, but in those short category romances I'm talking about, it's not something that I'm particularly good at, but it's a very it's a very difficult skill to master. So I learned my lesson. It's not easy to get a romance novel published, but so that kind of set me on the path, and I joined Romance Writers Australia as part of that journey, and that was what ultimately led to publication. So my very first book came out, and I'd accidentally written a rural romance. Who knew? I didn't know there was even a genre called rural romance. So you're getting a picture of me here as someone who's not very competent at this. I've got better as I've gone along. Like I've learned lessons. So I didn't know there was a there was a genre called rural romance. But my very first teaching job was at a very small school in Gippsland, in East Gippsland in Victoria. So, or actually not in East Gippsland, in near Sale. So a little tiny school called Longford. And I went there as a city girl, a girl who knew really nothing about living in the country. And to be frank, I was an idiot. Like, I had no idea about, like, the very first day I wore really high heels to school, which is not smart for a teacher anyway, but like, it's really not smart for a rural teacher. So I also had to deal with a snake on yard duty, where I was more frightened than the children. We had a bushfire the very first week I started working there, and a flood. So a bushfire, a storm, and then a flood, none of which I was prepared for. And so the people that in the school, the people that I worked with, and the beautiful parent community just adopted me, and they recognised that I was this silly young thing from the city that had no clue what she was doing. And they took pity on me, and they helped me out. So when I came back to the city, I eventually ended up with a job back in the city. When I came back, that story, not my story, but that idea of a city girl in the country really resonated with me. And so when I wrote my first novel, that was what it was about. And who knew, but the genre of rural romance was just taking off. And I read a book, like that was the original idea that I tried to sell to Mills and Boon, but it had too many characters and they didn't end up wanting it. So I put it in the drawer, kept writing, and then I read a book by Rachel Johns called Jilted, and it was a rural romance, and it was doing really well. And I went, hey, I've got a book that's kind of like this. I'm going to see if somebody wants it. So I went to the Romance Writers of Australia conference in Fremantle. I pitched to an editor there, and long story short, she took my book and I was off. And so that was the first of the 6 novels to be published. So maybe I might go on now and tell you a little bit about my current book, which is this one, The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. As I said, this is not a rural romance. This is contemporary fiction with, well, I guess it's been actually, this is really interesting. I'd love to know where you put this in the library, where I suppose it's just on the fiction shelves, but some bookstores have actually housed it with the historical fiction, which really surprised me, because it really worries me to think that the 1960s are now considered historical, but sadly they are. So it's got a timeline, as I said, that starts in the 1960s and a contemporary one. And what it's about is, it's about Shirley, the title character, Shirley Sullivan, who is, she's an elderly woman, or an older woman. She's 79 years old. And at the beginning of the novel, we see her planning to, and then subsequently taking, her 83-year-old husband, Frank, from his nursing home in suburban Sydney. Now, there's lots of reasons why this happens, and I don't want to give away any spoilers today, but pretty much Shirley's been a good girl all her life. She's grown up to do what she thinks is the right thing by her parents and her school at first, and then later on her workplace, and then her husband. She's very much a woman of that era, that she was born in the 1940s, and she's been a good, obedient girl, and she's been pushed around a little bit, not necessarily deliberately by society. Society has sort of said to her, you know, you must obey us. And so she's always tried to do the right thing. And she's found herself in this situation where she's had to leave her home in Geelong, where she had lived her whole married life and brought up her daughter. She's had to leave that home, go to live with her daughter, Fiona, in Sydney, and her beautiful husband, Frank, has found himself, he's now got dementia, and he's found himself being placed in this home. And Shirley, there was a reason why that happened, but that reason has now resolved itself and Shirley's ready to take charge again, but Fiona's got other ideas. So Shirley steals Frank from the home, and she takes him on the journey that Frank has always wanted to go on with her. So it's a road trip along the south coast of New South Wales and down into Victoria through Gippsland in a combi van. So that's the present day story. And the reason I chose that, and maybe I can talk a little bit later on maybe about research or whatever, but the reason that I chose that particular journey is that I wanted to take Frank back through the places where he'd grown up. So the backstory has Shirley growing up in Geelong and Frank comes from Gippsland. And there's a reason for that, which I'm going to share with you now. So the backstory was influenced by two things. The story idea, sorry, I'm just getting rid of some books so I can show you something. The story was influenced by two things. The first thing was a newspaper article that I read about 15 years ago, I think it was, about an elderly couple who had escaped from their nursing home. This was in the United States, but it's not unusual for elderly people to wander off from homes, and particularly more so in the past when security wasn't as tight. But what was interesting about this couple is that they went on the run for about 4 or 5 days and evaded authorities for that entire time. They were actually captured at one point. And so they were captured by the police, and the woman talked the police into letting them both go. She convinced them that they were not the couple that the police were seeking. And I just thought that was fascinating. And because they were clearly had an end destination in mind, they were going somewhere. They weren't just running away, they were running to something. And I wondered about that for a really long time, about where it was this couple were going to. But so the idea kind of sat in the back of my head for years and years and years. And it wasn't until 2 years ago when I discovered this that I put it together as a story. So what's in this box, which I'm going to show you in a minute, are 67 love letters written from my mum to my dad and my dad back to my mum. And they met Dad, actually, I think, at a dance in Geelong. There's a little bit more of the story to this, but I won't go into that. But they met in Geelong. My dad was a surf lifesaver, and he was down on the book for a surf carnival. And he met my mother at a dance at the Palais Royal Dance Hall in Geelong. And so, so graphical distance between them. So they wrote letters to each other for 2 years before they eventually got engaged, and my dad moved down to Melbourne to be closer to mum, and then they subsequently, I don't know if you'll be able to see how well you'll be able to see this, but this was the photo that in this, I found these letters. Mum and Dad died over a decade ago, and my place got flooded. So I just had packed it up from their place, put it in a box, never looked at it. And then when my house got flooded 2 years ago, I had the box that these originally came. Yes, I'm just going to put it up really close to the screen. So that's my mum and dad in the very early 1960s. And that photo, that's, even though physically they don't, Shirley and Frank don't look like this, but it was just that idea of this young couple in love in the early 1900s. I'll just quickly show you some of the, that's my dad's handwriting. So that's from Dad to Mum, and I can't actually see the date on that one, but, and then I'll read. So I was actually quite surprised to find that my dad had kept all those letters. Like, my dad could be, but he was also a very sort of gruff big, burly, sort of masculine man. Not that there's anything effeminate about, letter writing, but I was just his letters as well as mum keeping them. So when I discovered those letters, I put them all into chronological order. It took me about 2 days. I put them into chronological order, and then I read them from the beginning to the end. So because eventually they will find them in a box and read them and then be showing them to people in an author talk. So, there's a tip for all of you. But I did wonder, like I haven't shared the contents of the letters with anyone, only myself. Very open person, and she did discuss love quite openly with me. So, and there's nothing really untoward in the letters. They are emotionally very, but mum and dad have been gone such a long time. I kind of feel like, I think my mum would forgive me for peeking into her private life so many times on social media. And I did a magazine interview recently, and it's going to be in that. So I think my mum was a very outlet. So so those letters were the inspiration. But I do want to say that the book is not my parents' story, not at all. Like letters were really just a jumping off point for me. It was the thing that sparked the inspiration for the book. So so Katie, how are we going? Have we got any questions?
Yeah, I certainly do. So just going back to, I think the first question I'd love to ask you is, because you have been writing full time for 7 years and because you've got that, what does your writing routine look like?
Now, this is I am very organised in terms of routine usually. I've found writing during the pandemic has put me off a bit. I am organised. People hate me when when you have to show those photos. Writers often get asked to show photos of their desks, mine up a little bit so I don't look so A-type, because I'm really anally tidy. Even mid-draft, in the middle of the day, my desk might go in order for me. So, so it won't probably be a surprise to you then to learn that I do the same thing pretty much every day. I'm a full-time writer. It's my job. It's how so therefore I need to be systematic about it. And I write in business hours. So I actually start work around about 10 o'clock every day, and that's my run. And so I head out most mornings with my dog for a run along the river here from between Ocean Grove and Barwon Heads. So I run that track most days. And then I'm also a coffee addict. Can't write without coffee. So I come home, and then I get ready, sit down at my desk and start my day. I do a little bit of faffing around. So when I say faffing around, I might start writing till about 10:30. It takes me about half an hour to get my brain engaged into work mode. But from 10:30 until about 5 at night, I write. I should take a lunch break, but I never do. I eat, clearly, because once I'm in writing mode, I don't want to break that. I'm really quite happy at my desk. So that's in terms of ritual. That's what I do. I'm a word count. So I listen to these sorts of talks. I'm really interested in what other writers do, and I listen to these types of talks all the time. And it's so interesting what people do. Some people write, for instance, there's a fantastic romance writer, Claire Connolly, who can write a book in just a few weeks. And she'll put on social media, I've just started my book, and then boom, 3 weeks later, I'd finished, where she will just sit down at her desk and her husband will feed the kids and whatnot. She will virtually not leave her office or wherever she's writing, but I will sit down and write in business hours, as I said, and I aim for 2,000 words every day. I don't always get that, and some days I get a bit more, but when I'm in first draft, I aim for 10,000 a week. So if I have a bad day today and I only write 1,500, then I have to make it up somewhere else along the way. If I haven't made my word count through the week, well, then I will work on Saturday.
And so at that rate, how long does it take to get your first draft written?
You would think it would be quick, wouldn't you? You'd think just a few, but it takes me at least 6 months. And that is because I don't plan my novels I do a very rough outline. I often don't know exactly what the ending will be when I start. I had a few ideas, but I didn't know exactly what was going to happen at the end. And every novel that I've tried to really meticulously plot, because I'm an organised person, you would think that I would be a plotter. That I'm not a plotter. Like, I don't like not to be organised, and it makes me stressed. But every time I plot a novel, it makes me more stressed. Like, if I write it all out in this detailed plan, and I know, like, brilliant writers like Jane Harper, for instance, she does these amazing writes almost the length of a short novel in her outline, whereas I'd be over it. If I did that, I'd think I'm not interested in that idea anymore and I'd want to start something new. So long, because sometimes, like at the moment, I'm about 38,000, I think, into a new idea, and I've decided this week that it's gone off track, and I'm going to need to probably dip at least the last 10,000 words, if not more. Because I mean, sometimes you don't realise that too much into the second draft. I'm going, I'd be best to rein it in, and even though I've written all those words, they're going to go in the bin. So and sometimes, like in between The Art of Friendship, Shirley Sullivan, I wrote 40 to 50,000 words of a new book, or pieces of me that I just threw out because it just wasn't working. Went to New York to research it. Oh, well, I got it. That was good. Cost us a fortune. My husband's still not speaking to me. No, I'm kidding. And that's, and I feel like it worked. It doesn't always work, but I feel like it really worked for me in this current book, because I feel like the ending was really fresh, and it kind of, it doesn't always work. So there's a danger in that. I would like to plot more, but I'm just not good at it.
What I really love about your current book is that it feels like an exploration. As you said, you've come from sort of writing romance, and now this is what I would consider a love, that anything hugely dramatic had to happen. It's just everyday experiences that we have within our relationships that makes it so beautifully relatable. Even, especially Shirley's could relate to so much that she was going through.
Yeah.
And I think that there was that real sense that her whole inner mind was being explored. So I don't know if you can plot something like that out, or if you just have to follow the little threads of what Shirley wanted to.
The character very much led, and this is always the case when I'm writing, she very much led me where she wanted to go. I knew she had a secret when I started the book, so I knew that she was hiding something from Frank, but I didn't know what it was until I got to it, and then I know.
No, it doesn't.
And I'm not a very woo-woo person. Like I'm a very practical person, but create determine where the book goes. So I really wanted to shine a light. Like I think, and I probably didn't even realise this as much when I started out, but the application says something like, for all the women that paved the way, especially my mum. And I really feel like that's true in terms of, for me, is that I have an enormous gratitude to women who've been able to live. And I don't have daughters, I have 3 sons, but I have nieces. And I just, that each generation of women that comes to leave the world a better place for them. And I really, truly believe that people like my mum, who was not a card-carrying feminist, she was liberation. And I'm grateful to those women too, but their change comes when ordinary people do ordinary things in their life. So some of the changes that Shirley made and her own, Rita is more of the more militant, not that she's militant as such, but she's a much more sort of active feminist, whereas Shirley's just someone who's sure that her own daughter is brought up in a way where she has opportunities that perhaps Shirley herself didn't have. So, and that was what my mum did for me. My mum was held a job after she had children, or very rarely had, a couple of little part-time jobs, but her family and her children were her world. But she raised a daughter to believe that she could do, marriage and children as being the be all and end all, even though my mum was very happily married. So it's not as if she was in a marriage that hadn't worked out for her. She was very happily married, contented mother, although I'm sure, there were times where that probably drove her crazy too, like all of us mums. But she brought me up to believe that I could do anything I wanted, and that I should, and being not that there was no value in being a homemaker, but if that's what I really wanted, but if I wanted something else, that I should go for that. And so that's revolution of women's ideas and thinking, and how hard it was in that time.
It occurs over that lifetime, and I think that's why some bookshops may be drawn to pop the book in historical fiction, because a lot of Shirley's quite historical in terms of contemporary whatever it is, contemporary life and family life and marriage and all those sorts of things. So it's beautiful to see, and laid against Rita, how she lives her own life. It's such a subtle rebellion that I'm sure lots of people can relate to, as Shirley subtly paves her own way and finds her voice self.
Yes.
Now, I've got a question here from Heather, who's thanking you for sharing the photo and the story of your parents. she's really looking forward to reading The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. However, she's just dementia and ended up in aged care. Oh, sorry, she had dementia and ended up in aged care. Do you have any personal experience of dementia, and do you think that she'd find the storyline?
I don't know, but I have had recently, because I can't tell Heather only because I don't know your personal experience and how you'll react to it. The feedback in these past 2 weeks from people who, and I don't know if Yvonne's actually in here, but Yvonne is one of my readers who has her husband, Comfort. So that's feedback from someone who's dealing with the situation right now. The older Frank I based on my own grandfather, who was in a home here on the Ballarat 92. And actually my grandfather only died shortly before my own mother died. So he had quite a long life and she had a short life. So he only, she only just outlived him. But he does and says based on my own experience with my grandfather. But I also did months and months and months of research into dementia and age. I did a lot of reading and read a lot of first-hand accounts from carers of people who have dementia and also from people who have dementia themselves. So and this is something, just if anyone is interested in this, one of the things that I did as a addition to my research is I became a dementia online course that you can do. If you just Google Dementia Friend, you'll find it. It's an online course that anyone can do, and you just go through the units. And when I say a course, it will take you, it's take an hour or at most. At all. But what it does is highlight to people ways that we in the community can make life for dementia patients a little bit easier and a little bit friendlier, so that if you do come to shops or through your work or whatever, that you can have a bit more of an understanding of what they're going through, and that way perhaps interact with them in an appropriate way that is going to make them feel great about it. I recommend that to anyone. So to answer Heather's question, I can't guarantee it, Heather, but I've done heaps of research. And to walk a line, this is perhaps not exactly to Heather's question, but I wanted to walk the line between understanding that aged care is not for everyone, and that there are some I want to demonise people who work in aged care. I know personally some aged care workers, and I do acknowledge that there are problems within this terrible, and many aged care workers, in fact I would guess the bulk of them, really care about the people that they care for, and are doing a really couple of aged care workers read it before it was published, because I wanted to make sure that those people didn't feel demonised or maligned in any way. And I hope you read it, Heather, but I would totally understand if you chose not to.
That sounds like a great resource. Thank you for sharing that with us. We'll definitely be looking that up just for ourselves as well. And what I'll add to that conversation, Heather, is that triggering or anything, I identified more with Fiona, and I'm a bit of a Fiona. So yeah, I found it more that I was identifying with the daughter of wanting to control what my parents, their little Frank and Shirley moment was last year up to Queensland. So I'm Fiona.
Let's talk about Fiona very quickly. Fiona is a character that people probably don't have a great deal of sympathy for during the book review. And so I was trying to show what she would feel and how other people's decisions affected her. And I wanted to highlight that sometimes as we age, we get input into. But by the end of the book, we see, hopefully, a bit of redemption for Fiona. And I certainly, as the author, and I have been in the carer situation with my parents, and I certainly know that it's not black and white, and that it's a very difficult position to be in. And I hope that by the end of the novel, even if you've sort of been irritated with Fiona through the novel, that by the end.
Yes, beautiful. Heather is saying, thank you, Lisa. She's definitely going to give it a try. And she's actually asked a question that has come up a couple of times, and about me, when you were talking earlier about that you were a young reader and that you used to have questions that you'd imagine that you could ask your favourite authors. Who were your favourite authors? And what would you ask them about?
I'm just, if I could put my hands on it, I'd have to stand up and then you'd have to see what I was wearing. There was I can't think of the author's name offhand. I've got all my children's books in here, all my favourite children's books. But there was an Australian author. The very first book I can remember is a book called Pookie, which my mum used to read to me. And I went to school at 4.5 and I could already read then, before I went to school, but because I think that made me sound smart. But actually, really, she taught me to read because she read to me every single night. And, you know, they learned to read by having, you know, those texts read repetitively over and over and over. So I started off with little books like Miffy, but Mum would read this Pookie book, which was a beautiful, Miss Ivy something, but I can't think of her surname. Anyway, so I went, sort of graduated. I could read by the time I was 4.5, which is hence why we needed the Mum would buy me a little golden book, or later on an Enid Blyton book, and Enid Blyton became just my hero, my heroine, my literary heroine. I would get off that age. But then, you know, that was pretty much Mum would be at the end of the budget, so all the other books would have to be borrowed. But other favourite childhood authors, apart from Enid Blyton, were people like this woman who had written the Julie Gordon series, which early version of, I guess, what would later on become popular with young girls, like The Babysitter's Club, that type of novel. But this was a book about a girl called Julie Gordon, and she did very interesting pony club, and I had a horse when I was little, so I loved that. Julie Gordon, the exchange student, so she went over to, you know, America as an exchange student, but she was an Australian. I wish I could think of the author's name, and but I'm not showing you my tracksuit pants, so I'm sorry. And there was also another I read, and this is an old when I was quite young. I loved that. But I also was very fortunate that my very best friend, Fiona, who I'm still really close to these days, she and I, our early favourites were things like Little House on the Prairie and Little House in the Big Woods, so the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. I also loved, I don't think Fiona loved these ones as much, but I loved the whole Eddie Did at School. But our absolute favourite was Anne of Green Gables. We just loved Anne. We were totally... Oh, and then as we were I read Little Women. We both loved that, and I've got that here. This was my mum's book, and if you look, it's so beautiful. In the 50s movie, I think that's June Allison. So that's my mum's book, and I've still got it. And I still
beautiful.
Read it.
That's lovely. And what about now? What's on your reading pile now?
I'll show you what I'm reading right now. I've got 3 books here, or what I've just read actually, and what I'm reading right now. And but I've got a few other favourites as well. So this is who we are. This is a fantastic... I don't really read a lot of suspensey type novels. I tend to like the same sorts of contemporary sort of fiction where it's based on a friendship, but it's very character driven. So suspense and really plot driven novels are not necessarily my go-to. However, which is a suspensey novel, but it's set in everyday life. So it's, I guess, domestic noir, I guess, or domestic suspense, who are about to attend their high school reunion. So it's a group of people in their 40s who've all, you know, went to school together, and you know, and people start getting threatening letters, and so there's a suspense element to it. But amazing thing about that, there's 7 point of view characters. And I know some of you will think, oh no, that's way too many. And normally I would be one of those people. 7 point of view characters. You are never confused. You never wonder who's talking. It's a really skillful and brilliant novel. So there's that one. It's my friend, so it's such a beautiful book, and she is such a talent. It's my friend Kirsty Manning, The Lost Jewels. And this has got multiple timelines in it, and it's about these exquisite jewels. Not too much about it. I haven't finished reading it. I'm nearly finished it, but it is just exquisitely written, and Kirsty does the most amazing research. She's so clever, and at the moment.
Gorgeous. And look out for that one. We did a Frank talk with Kirsty recently, so look out for that one on our YouTube channel as well.
And I wanted to show you this. This is not a novel, but I just thought with us being in the pandemic at the moment that people might be interested in this book. My friend in America and Canada earlier this year, just before everything went into lockdown, so she was so lucky. And she bought me my favourite city on earth. I could live anywhere else, it would be New York. I love New York with a passion. And I accost people when they're going to New York with all my tips of where because I've been there a few times. Coffee from here, and I drive them crazy with all my tips. So unasked for. So I did this to Kelly, but Kelly's a coffee fiend like me. So I gave her lots of coffee tips, which is a book guide to New York. And because we can't get out at the moment and go to bookshops, I've been flicking through this. This has got significance in New York. If you love a coffee table book, I mean, I don't know if it's even available in Australia, but this is a beautiful book just to, you know, savor if you're a book lover and you'd book to have.
Beautiful. We have a question here from Karen asking, what do you find is the hardest element of the writing process? For example, making the time, getting the
Karen,
characters'
all of
voices
it.
right, or knowing when you're finished.
Really hard. I like it when it's finished, like when it's over. Actually, probably starting. Like I like the research part. I really like that. So for Shirley, for instance, I did the road trip that Frank and Shirley do. I didn't do it in a copy, but because I haven't driven a manual car for so long that I wasn't confident I'd beat it at the time. So I did that whole trip, and I did that so that I would get every detail right. If they're at a beach, I've sat on that beach. At the time of day, they sat on it. Like I process. But then when I start, it's a little bit like I was saying before, when I do the outline and then I start to lose passion for it. If I put in when I start, I lose confidence in the idea often, and I have to be pushed. I'm very fortunate to have really Worth and also Rachel Johns and a number of other, Kirsty that I was talking about earlier. Kirsty and I often sprint together. We do writers sprinting, come back in half an hour and tell me how many words you've done, so we keep each other accountable. But what I get from that writing community that I'm part of is the confidence from self-doubt. Every time I write a book, I'm not really sure how I did it. And when I get to the end, I always think I can never possibly do that ever again. And that's where I'm at right now. I suggested to Sally and Kelly that the problem was the book that it was written in first person, and that I was going to go back and rewrite the 30,000 words in third person. Down. There's nothing wrong with the 30,000 words that you've got. Just keep going. So, I think getting started is, I also, although this pandemic has made me get better at this, to promote the books when I'm finished, because I'm of a generation where we were taught that you don't ever talk yourself up. I love talking about writing and about books, but it's very difficult. I'm not a person that loves to say, buy my book, it's fantastic, it's better than, I can sell you Kirsty's book or Sally's book, but it's very difficult for me to talk a selling aspect. I really dislike that. But I've had to do so much more of that sort of getting my face out there, and more of the sort of more traditional sort of promotional stuff this time around, because I'm not out there at events, live events, and it's been harder for people to get. So yeah, all of it, Karen. It's all hard.
It's a great answer. We have time for one more question, and we've got one here from Jessica, who is asking, will you ever write a book based in New York? Or
no,
Jess,
I think I probably will. I would love to write a book in New York, and I was actually planning to write a book either set in London or New York as my next book, but I can before I can travel there. And I'm really someone who does really lots of in-depth research, and I get into my character's shoes and feel what they feel and see what they see, actually being in the place, so spending a significant amount of time in the place. And even though I've been to New York lots of times, the last time I went was about 2 or 3 years ago now. So things change, and it'll be interesting. And of course the pandemic, like after the lockdown there and the, all the terrible things that have happened, I don't really know what it would be hard for me to set a book, say, that is set in, say, back there and looking at what it's like. So but maybe London, because if I could go back, like London I have lived in, and I know, and I was in London last year, and I know London really, really well. So I often, even if it's not rural romance, I often set my books in small country towns and I often have Melbourne in there somewhere as well. I really love Australia, and I love writing. And I think I've got a very Australian book in New York or London. It would have an Australian protagonist, because that's who I am, and that's kind of what I know. So, no, if I can, Jessica, one day.
It's a great excuse for a holiday anyway, isn't it? Doing all that research. Beautiful. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time together now via our Borrow Box, RB Digital and Cloud Library app. So they're free to borrow with your Frankston Library membership. You can also purchase Lisa's books via the Robertson's Bookshop. We'll put a link to our social media channels. Please keep an eye on the Frankston City Library's website for some great Frank Talks that are coming up. As we mentioned, there's already quite a few on our YouTube channel that are definitely worth checking out. And keep safe, look out for each other, and we look forward to seeing you in our libraries when we're able to reopen. Thanks so much, Lisa, for your time today. Thank you.